Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's evening conversation on God and the Multiverse. I'm Cherie Harder. I'm the president of the Trinity Forum, and we are really excited tonight to be able to partner with both BioLogos and Church of the Advent in tonight's completely sold-out program. We're thrilled that you're here. It's clear that seating is really tight. If there's a few of you who don't yet have a seat, there's a couple right up here in front where you can join us. But if you find yourself stuck outside or with a bad view, there are a few options. One, we are live streaming tonight, so you can always catch us virtually if you can't see us actually. In addition, we'll be posting video from tonight's event on our website at www.ttf.org by the weekend's end, as well as photos, feedback, and the like on Facebook so you can follow along. As some of you might know, this is the inaugural event in a four-part series that we're hosting with a new initiative called Discovery and Doxology, which has been made possible through the very generous sponsorship of a grant through the Templeton Religion Trust. And we're grateful that both Chris Stewart and Kara Ingram from the Templeton Religion Trust are with us tonight. I think I see you out there. Thanks so much for coming. Also just wanted to acknowledge a few other special guests and groups as well. We're delighted to have Dr. Francis Collins with us, one of our trustees, Doug Wilson, a BioLogos trustee, Jennifer Wiseman, the faculty and students from the Ad Fontes Academy, new fellows from the Trinity Fellows Academy, and several friends of ours from the Dominican Order. Thrilled that you can make it. But we're also glad that each and every one of you is here for what promises to be quite a fascinating conversation this evening. Part of our mission at the Trinity Forum is to provide a space and resources for leaders to discuss life's greatest questions in the context of faith. And certainly, one of those great questions is the proper relationship between the claims of science and faith. And we live in an era where science and faith are widely believed to be in conflict. Among many, religious claims to truth are often regarded as suspect, dubious, possibly bigoted, even downright threatening. There's a spreading materialism which asserts or even assumes that only empirical knowledge is reliable and denigrates ways of understanding reality beyond the quantitative. Meanwhile, there are people of faith who fear that scientific discovery is somehow undermining spiritual truth or Christian orthodoxy and needs to be resisted or rebutted rather than pursued. Still others believe that the realms of science and faith belong to completely non-intersecting spheres, what the late Harvard paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould called non-overlapping magisteria. That is, they each had interesting things to say, but not much to say to each other. So tonight, we offer a different hypothesis, that science and faith actually have a great deal to say to each other and to us, and enabling us to better understand ourselves, our world, our place in the universe, and that in learning more about the ways and the wonders of the cosmos, we gain not only understanding, but are ultimately moved to awe and to worship. So tonight, we'll hear from an astrophysicist and a theologian about the implications of new discoveries about our universe, and I'm honored to get to introduce both of them. Dr. Deborah Haarsma is an astrophysicist, an experienced research scientist, and the president of BioLogos. She previously served as professor and department chair of physics and astronomy at Calvin College, and has several publications in the Astrophysical Journal and the Astronomical Journal on extragalactic astronomy and cosmology. Her research interests include very large galaxies at the center of galaxy clusters, very young galaxies undergoing rapid star formation in the early universe, and gravitational lenses where space-time is curved by a massive object. She is also the author of Origins, Christian Perspectives on Creation, Evolution, and Intelligent Design, and earned her Ph.D. in astrophysics after studying both physics and music at Bethel. Responding to Dr. Haarsma will be the Reverend Tommy Henson, who is the rector and a founder of the Church of the Advent in Washington, D.C., and of the Renew DC network. Tommy previously served as a mental health counselor for underserved populations while living and studying in Boston, and received his MDiv and MA in counseling from Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary. And then after Deb and Tommy's presentations, we'll have opportunity for an extended Q&A from the audience, often the most dynamic part of the evening. Deb, welcome.
Thank you, Sue. Good evening, everyone. It is a pleasure and a privilege to be here at the National Press Club and to be partnering with the Trinity Forum. We're so excited about this series for BioLogos and for our two organizations that we can be bringing a better conversation on science and faith to here in the nation's capital and to our churches. This evening, I would like to start by asking you to think of a time when you looked up at the night sky and felt a sense of wonder. Maybe you looked up at a sunset. Maybe you were out in the countryside and you looked up and you saw all of the stars beautifully laid out before you, stars filling the entire sky, sparkling. Maybe you've seen the Milky Way, a band of stars across the whole sky. Maybe you've seen a meteor shower. When we see these things, our hearts are filled with wonder, and your whole body relaxes, and your brain changes, and you ponder things beyond yourself. And this experience is true for people all over the world and through all times and cultures. Tonight, what I want to do is to share with you some of recent discoveries in astronomy, some of what we're learning about our picture of the universe, and some of the speculation about the multiverse. And I hope you'll have a little taste of that sense of wonder as we go along. So, as we said, I'm an astronomer, and I did a lot of my observations with this telescope. This is a radio telescope. As you can see, it's not the ordinary kind that you look through with your eye. This one detects radio waves, and it's called the Very Large Array. It's located in New Mexico. And each of those antennas there is a quarter of a football field across. And they all move in unison together, and they move up and down those railroad tracks. It's a pretty cool instrument to be able to use. And I had the privilege of using it to be able to study some of the things Cherie mentioned. Some very small galaxies, some very large galaxies, some places where space itself is curved. Now, science, as some of you here know, is an ambitious project. It involves a lot of challenges, a lot of hard work, but there are these gems of moments. And for me, that came after analyzing data for weeks and finally having the image come up on screen and go, yes, that is something new that nobody has seen before in the universe. And I get to see it. And then I get to share it with others. And for me, that is what I feel God has called me to do. Now, I'm not alone in feeling a sense of wonder about science. I know people who have their favorite protein. I know scientists who have their favorite bone in the body. I know somebody who studies pelvic bones. She's so excited about pelvis. Oh, man. I know a physics professor who will make his students cheer in class whenever he puts up a new fundamental law of nature on the chalkboard. That physicist happens to be my husband. So scientists really have a strong sense of wonder and excitement about what they do. And this is counter to a common stereotype. The stereotype is that scientists just pick everything apart, analyze it to death, and remove all of the wonder and fun out of it, and just make it not as exciting. And just the opposite, really. For those of us who study science, investigating it in depth fills us with more wonder. There's a great cartoon about this. If you Google slime mold beauty, you'll see a wonderful cartoon from XKCD. So science does not eliminate wonder. So let's move a little bit out into our universe. Here's a picture of the Andromeda Galaxy. Now, as I say there, it's 2.5 million light years away. And that's just going off just a tad on the edge there, but it's 2.5 million light years away. So what that means is that it takes light 2.5 million years to travel from that galaxy to us. So light travels very fast. So if it takes 2.5 million years to travel, you know it's a long ways away. But this is nearby, actually. This is the nearest galaxy to our own. So for someone like me who studies galaxies, this is just a nearby one. But it is gorgeous. And what you can see here are these spiral arms. You can see a beautiful blue color in the outer part of the galaxy. That's an indication of stars that have formed recently. And you can even see other galaxies like this one, dwarf galaxies that are in orbit around the main galaxy. Now, that scientific explanation that I just gave you and sketched out is something that all scientists would agree on, all astronomers would agree on that. But for me as a Christian, it goes a step further. Now, there's a sense of wonder and beauty when you look at this. But for me, it points to the heavens declaring the glory of God. As it says in Psalm 19, verse 1, the skies proclaim the work of his hands. So that means that not only do I have this sense of awe, but a sense that there is a plan, that there is a creator, and from what the rest of Scripture and from the person of Jesus Christ, I know that there is a person behind the universe. So when I look up at the night sky, it's not just a sense of awe, it's also a sense of worship of the one who created it all, who also knows me personally. Now, I don't want you to think of this sense of wonder thing as just beauty. Now, clearly there is a lot of beauty here, and I love beauty in the natural world. But there's also a sense of vastness, of power, even of danger. There's violent and dramatic things that happen in the universe, explosions you wouldn't want to be within light years of because you would die. And so I don't want you to think of the glory of God as like a fuzzy Hallmark greeting card or something. This is something that's really dramatic and beyond us and powerful. And it gives us a scope and a feeling of who God is. It stretches our imaginations to better understand God. All right, so moving out from that, here are photos of a bunch of different galaxies. These were all made by Calvin students when I was their professor. And these galaxies, I wanted to use this to illustrate the expansion of the universe. So nearly 100 years ago, Edwin Hubble first discovered that the galaxies are moving apart, and they're moving apart at a speed that is proportional to their separation. And so it looks something like this. There they go. So these galaxies are moving apart, and from that image, I just had the animation move them at a constant speed. So if I do it with my hands here, you can see that the galaxies, the expansion might be just something like that. But what we've learned in the last 20 years is that the expansion rate is actually changing with time. So it starts out fast, and then it slows down a bit, and then it speeds up again. So I'll try and do that here. So it starts fast, and then slows down, and then speeds up. And we're currently in that final speeding up stage. The current universe is currently accelerating in its expansion. And this was not anticipated at all. This was a big surprise. And that highlights something else that I think science fosters in us, and that is humility. So scientists, I know, all have a sense of humility in the face of the data. Now, there's plenty of arrogant people in the sciences, so I'm not saying that. But there's something about always being willing to modify your ideas in the face of the data that you're looking at. And our whole community had to do that in the face of this. Everybody thought the universe was currently slowing down, and here we find it's currently speeding up. So it was a big discovery. The Nobel Prize was given for this in 2011 to Perlmutter, Schmidt, and Rees. I just have to say, Adam Rees and I were graduate students at the same time, and at that time we were working on a similar project, and then he went on to do this. So, I was like, shucks, opportunity missed there. I don't know. So the universe is currently accelerating in its expansion. Now, what I want to do next is have us imagine what would it have been like in the past. So if the galaxies are moving apart now, then they would have been closer together in the past, and it would look something like this. There they are. The galaxies would have been closer together. All of that material would have been packed, and as they even further back in time, they would have been packed into a very dense state. It would have been very hot, and that early hot state is referred to as the Big Bang. Now, astronomers in the early 1900s typically thought that the universe was infinitely old. And so this discovery in 1965, with this telescope here, Penzias and Wilson detected the heat radiation from that early hot, dense state. And that heat radiation is still with us. It's cooled way down, but it can be detected all over the sky. And that discovery convinced the community that there was indeed a beginning to the universe. We went from some leading cosmologists saying, well, we can't have a beginning to the universe. That would smack of religion. To saying, oh, well, of course there's a Big Bang. And God didn't start it off. The Big Bang started itself. So the narrative quickly changed, and the Big Bang, unfortunately, became associated with an atheistic worldview, that the universe could just begin itself, that it was something that replaced God. But remember what I said earlier, a scientific explanation does not replace God. For me, the Big Bang is a scientific description, and for most scientists it is, a description of the early universe, how it expanded and cooled and eventually formed the stars and the galaxies that we see today. And then for me as a Christian, I see that as a description of how God is at work in the universe, how God developed this universe and created all of these amazing structures. All right, now that heat radiation is coming at us from all around the sky. I've got a little photograph of it here. I'm also wearing earrings that have the same photograph. Can't resist. By the way, this is an advantage of having a husband in the same field as me. He found these online for me. That's what counts for romance in the Haarsma household. That was really good. So this afterglow of the Big Bang, this heat radiation, you can see what this is illustrating here is that it's not uniform. And in different directions in the sky, some places it looks slightly warmer, slightly cooler. These red and green and blue splotches are representing that. And what that tells us is that the universe isn't uniform over the whole sky. This is an important point I'm going to come back to later, so just remember that picture. One of the other discoveries of this recent 20 years of astronomy is that we now know when the universe began. 13.80 plus or minus 0.04 billion years ago. And I hear some oohs of appreciation, which tells me there are some people here who see how significant that is. Oh my goodness, when I was a young graduate student, the debates over this. Some people thought it was 10 billion years old, 15 billion years old, 20 billion years old. Who knows? We don't, billions, yes, but just very uncertain. The idea of precision cosmology was a joke. It really was. We joked about that. Oh yeah, I mean, we don't even know what we're doing within a factor of 2. And here we are 20 years later, and we know that it is, know the age of the universe with less than 1% uncertainty. So that is a very exciting development that we can understand that about God's creation. Now, I know though, for some people, they're not as excited about the error bar there as they are concerned about the word billion. And I know that because that was my own background. I grew up in a Christian home, and I grew up in a wonderful church and learned about Jesus and learned to love God there. But the only Christian viewpoint we knew was that the universe was young. A plain reading of Genesis 1 saying that the universe was about 6,000 to 10,000 years old, created over 6 days. Yes, we'd heard of the Big Bang, but that was this atheist idea that replaced God. That clearly wasn't right. So how to bring these together? How do we understand the Bible and the natural world alongside each other? And I want to take a few minutes here just to explain to you how I understand that Genesis 1 text for 2 reasons. For Christians, we believe that the Bible is the inspired word of God. It's God's authoritative word for our lives. So we have to know how to deal with this passage that appears to be in contradiction with what we're learning about creation, about God's creation from the evidence left in it. And the other reason is for people who are not Christians. They need to know, how can you be a Christian with integrity when you have your holy book is saying something that is clearly contrary to science? So I didn't know the answer to this either until I was fortunate enough to read some great biblical scholars who explained to me something of the original context of that passage. The Bible is an ancient book. It grew out of ancient cultures some 3,000 years ago in Egypt and Babylon and Israel. And they had a very different view of the world than we do today. They believed that the earth was flat. Of course it was flat. They believed that there was a solid dome sky. They pictured the sky as a solid dome with an ocean of water above, and occasionally there would be slits in the dome and rain would fall. That was a common image they had of the sky. And so for them, the universe had a very different physical picture. But for those of you who know the Genesis text, when it's describing the 6 days of creation, the second day, it says that God said, "Let there be a firmament to separate the waters above from the waters below." And I never knew what that meant when I was a kid. But once I learned about this ancient culture, it all clicked. This was God putting things in the terms that the people of the time would understand. God accommodated his message to them. And he didn't try to correct their mistaken understandings of the physical world. He didn't try to explain actually the earth is round, actually the sky is an atmosphere. None of that. God accommodated his message to the people of that time. And that speaks to me powerfully of who God is, of his graciousness, of his willingness to meet us where we're at. And it also says that God's primary point, the intention in Genesis 1, was not to teach about science. It was to proclaim his other messages, the goodness of creation, the sovereignty of God over every aspect of creation. And humans is a very good part of it as people who bear his image. So if the science wasn't the point for them, I don't think it's the point for us either in that Genesis 1 passage. So I still take it as God's inspired and authoritative word, but I don't believe it is teaching us about science in the modern sense. All right. So you came to hear about the multiverse. So to introduce that, I want to first talk a little bit about fine-tuning of the universe. So question, what is needed in the universe for life as we know it? Well, first question is, what is life as we know it? And here I'm thinking not so much of intelligent life. Let's just take bacteria, some simple single-celled organism. What do we need to have just a cell functioning? Well, even any kind of life that I can imagine needs two things. It's going to need some complex chemistry. So hydrogen and helium just don't have what it takes to make all the complexities that you need in a cell. And you also need an energy source. A nice, stable, long-lived energy source would be lovely. Now, the two things in the universe that provide that are stars, long-lived stars. So stars are where elements are produced. The carbon and nitrogen and oxygen in our bodies all came from the centers of stars. You are indeed made of stardust. God made us from stardust. And we also need a stable energy source. So we need that. For that, we need long-lived stars, stars that can be a nice, provide a nice, stable incubator for life for a long period of time. Okay, so what do we need in the universe to have long-lived stars? Well, an impressive number of things just to make that work. I'll describe one of them for you. We need gravity, and then there's several other parameters as well, to be fine-tuned. And the image here is of a radio dial. I still have a radio dial on my clock radio. I don't know if any of you still fuss with that, but you have to tweak that dial just right and get it tuned in so it hits on the radio station. That's the picture here. The parameter, the strength of gravity has to be set just right in order for stars to form at all, and in order for them to be stable for long periods of time. So this is a picture of a lovely star-forming region, and all of these colors and swirls here are clouds of gas and dust. And there's various concentrations of those, like there's one here, and there's some concentrations there. And when you get a rather dense cloud of gas and dust, it might get disturbed, and it'll begin to rotate slowly and collapse down under gravity. And so all of this material is swirling together and collapsing down, and eventually forming a concentrated mass that's dense enough for fusion to start. And once fusion reactions start, then that's when the star turns on. That's what's the definition of a newborn star. So for that process to happen, well, it wouldn't happen without gravity, okay? So you just have some gas and dust floating around there. You need some gravity to pull it in, and you need enough to bring it together so that fusion can happen. But the strength of gravity can't be too large either, because if it's too large, well, then too much matter would collect, and it would get so dense that fusion would happen, yes, but it would happen so rapidly that all the fuel would burn up in a very short time. It would be a flash in the pan, not a nice, stable incubator. So the force of gravity has to be set just right, just like Goldilocks, not too hot, not too cold, just right. And there are several other parameters, fundamental parameters of the universe, that also need to be set to a fairly small tolerance in order to have a universe that's hospitable for life. And there's even some initial properties of the universe, things about its initial entropy state that have to be set just right. And this isn't just a Christian idea. This is very well known in astronomy. Here's a quote from Steven Weinberg. Life as we know it would be impossible if any of several physical quantities had slightly different values. Now, that is not to say that there aren't scientific explanations for some of those values. In fact, there are certain parameters where I have seen scientists actually come up with an explanation for how they got to be set to the values that they are. So for me, fine-tuning isn't so much about an absence of scientific explanation of, well, we don't know how, scientists have no idea how it was set to this value, so it must be God. It's more, wow, it's set to an amazing value. I wonder how God did that. Maybe he did it supernaturally, or maybe God did it through some natural process that he made so things could be set to this value. Either way speaks to God's craftsmanship of the universe, of how it's carefully structured so that it could be a place where life could develop and flourish. All right, but then along comes the multiverse. So first of all, the term multiverse. This has suffered from a lot of the same things that have plagued the term the Big Bang. Some people see the term and use the term as an atheistic worldview. The multiverse is, well, it's self-sustaining, it's infinitely old, it can spawn universes, we don't need God anymore. All that same line of argument shows up for the multiverse. But it also has another level of explanation that is a scientific model, scientific discussion, and in that context, we can have a different worldview interpretation of it. So Christians I know in this field agree that if there is a multiverse, we believe that God created it. God created all things. So the existence of a multiverse in alone just tells us maybe how God went about creating our universe. Okay, the second thing you need to know about the multiverse, the first is that it can be, make sure you know when they're talking about a worldview theory versus an atheistic worldview versus a scientific model. The second thing to know is that there are multiple scientific models around. And they don't all agree with each other. They're coming out of interestingly different lines of research, are prompting very different ideas about the multiverse. And some people are working to fit them together. But it's a very, there's not like a scientific consensus even about what is the best multiverse idea right now. So to give you a flavor, here's what a few of these ideas are. So one is the realization that our own universe may be infinite. And what we can see of our universe suggests that it could continue infinitely far in every direction. So what does that have to do with the multiverse? Well, one aspect of the multiverse that can be troubling is the idea of just how incredibly huge it is. But even in our universe, we're talking about infinite. And infinity is really big. And if you can picture it as big as you think it is, and then it's even infinitely bigger than that. Okay, so that means that way beyond our observable universe, there could be many galaxies out there that look very much like the Milky Way. Some of them might look nearly identical to the Milky Way. Maybe in one of those identical-looking Milky Ways way out there, there's a room full of people just like us in every way, except they all have one eye instead of two eyes. You know, there's just so many different possibilities out there. So that arises even before you consider a multiverse. Okay, next there's string theory. Now, string theory is an exciting development in recent years. It is our best idea going for how to combine quantum mechanics and gravity at a particle level. It has not been established yet with evidence. It's hard to have testable predictions for it. Some of those are coming along. Some of the new particle accelerators might test this. But one aspect of that theory is that it also predicts many universes and a multiverse. Then there's quantum mechanics, many worlds quantum mechanics. And the idea here goes way back to the early 1900s when physicists were developing the understanding of particles and trying to wonder what to make of all of the uncertainties at the quantum level. and how to interpret the mathematics that physicists have shown and demonstrated to be correct. So this is kind of a philosophical, semi-philosophical, semi-physics understanding of how quantum mechanics works. There's not a consensus on this among physicists, but if it were right, it would mean that we are constantly spawning entire new universes all the time. And then there's the inflationary multiverse. So I know I probably have just gone over your heads with even those short descriptions of the first three, but I'm going to spend a little longer here on the inflationary multiverse, maybe because it's closest to my own field. I find it more interesting. But I can give you a little more concrete flavor of what this one's about. And if you want to ask about the others, I can talk more about them in the question time. So the inflationary multiverse. Oh, first, these are two books here I wanted to mention by Brian Greene and Max Tegmark. These are two highly respected cosmologists, physicists, and they're not Christians, and you can tell that in their books. But I find that their work is generally giving a pretty fair shake to the science. So those are good places to learn more. And I believe they talk about 9 or 10 different types of multiverse ideas out there. So lots of things to learn about if you are interested. All right, the inflationary universe then. So what's going on here is, and I will point at the diagram. So the dawn of time, question mark. Okay, setting that aside for a moment. What's happening a tiny fraction of a second after the beginning? And we're talking here about 10 to the minus 33 seconds. So a decimal point and 33 zeros and then a 1, like very tiny fraction of a second. At that time, the universe was a seething mass of photons and quarks and weird elementary particles, and also some very strange energy fields. And it underwent a transition where it expanded by a factor of 10 to the 26. That's 10 with 26 zeros behind it. So it didn't double in size. It didn't go 100 times in size. It went 10 to the 26 times larger in size. And what that means is that fluctuations that were at the particle level before that, after that, become large enough to be nearly entire galaxies. Okay, I don't have a gut feel for this. Just to reassure you, if you're having trouble getting your mind around this, it's not like I have my mind around this either. These numbers are just fantastically incredible, astronomical. And they're really hard to grasp. And I don't know if anybody would have bought this theory for a moment if it hadn't actually served a purpose. And actually, this theory explains 3 or 4 or 5 issues that there were with the standard Big Bang model. And so it addresses issues that there already were in cosmology and addressed them well. So if you go from having 3 or 4 or 5 unexplained things to having one really bizarre theory, you might have gained something there. But what really sold people on this, I think, was that inflation made predictions that could be tested. And that is always the hallmark of good science. So inflation predicted what this structure, remember all the bumps on here? What that structure should look like, because those bumps go right back to these quantum fluctuations, if inflation is right. And it turns out it works. And this has just come in the last 10 some years or so, that we actually can tell that that radiation that we're seeing, the heat radiation from the early universe, has the signature that matches inflation's prediction very, very well. Okay, so the universe just got more bizarre, but we feel like we've got some understanding of what's going on there. Okay, and then we go one step further. Inflation predicts that there would be a multiverse. So the image here, this is showing a bunch of bubbles. An analogy, and do you see Earth? There's Earth, not to scale. But a reasonably good analogy is to consider a pot of water. You put it on to boil, and as you watch the water heat up, pretty soon you'll see a little bubble form and expand and rise to the top. In the inflation model, that little bubble, that's one expanding universe. But the thing is, you don't get just one bubble. When you undergo that phase transition of water going to boiling, you get lots of bubbles. And in a similar way here, most inflationary models predict that there would be many universes, and that they would have somewhat different physical properties. Some of them might be like this one, which looks like a pretty unfriendly, inhospitable place to be. And other ones might have parameters that are suited for life. And then it becomes a little less impressive that our universe is so well suited for us because, well, we're not going to be living in that inhospitable one. We couldn't survive there. We're going to be in the one that's well suited for us. But scientifically, you also need to know that this does not eliminate fine-tuning altogether. The multiverse would still need to be fine-tuned in some ways. It still has to be able to generate universes. It has to be able to generate them with a range of parameters that allow life. It has to have the basic laws of physics working. It has to be able to set this initial entropy condition. So fine-tuning isn't completely explained by the multiverse. And the other thing to know scientifically is that the multiverse actually would have had a beginning. Some of the people who first proposed inflation went on to do work and determined that, yes, the universe would need a beginning. It could not be infinitely old. The multiverse could not be infinitely old. So some of the things that are tossed around for the multiverse, that it could be infinitely old, that it eliminates fine-tuning, actually are not valid scientifically. Still, there's lots of questions about the multiverse. There's a purely scientific debate going on. Here's two respected cosmologists in different talks having very different opinions on whether this is science at all. Because we're talking about other universes, and by definition, we can't go there to do tests on them. We can't measure them. They don't impact our universe. It's very hard to do tests, any sort of test, to validate it. We do know that the inflationary model predicts other things that we've confirmed, but is it science if it predicts something else that we can't confirm? How much do we accept that prediction? And that's the question there. So that's a fascinating debate that philosophers of science and physicists are engaged in. And then there's the religious debate. So if, let's say, this turns out to be the way the universe really is, that there really is a multiverse, what then does that mean for religious questions, for us as humans? Well, there's a couple of questions there. One concern that I've heard Christians discuss is if there's so many different universes of so many different parameters, that means there could be a universe that's similar enough to us where there could be life, but life is really horrible. It's full of suffering and pain. And the questions that we wrestle with here on Earth, where we experience our fair share of suffering and pain, and how do we understand that in the context of a good and loving and all-powerful God, those questions can get magnified if you could have a whole universe where things are dominated by that. So that's an interesting question that we should be thinking about. Another question is about human significance in this whole picture, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But what I hear from most Christians is that, hey, this is cool, and that's kind of where I'm at. Like, if this turns out to be the way the universe is, like, whoa, the universe just got even more incredible, and that stretches my mind to see even more how much more amazing God is, how much more powerful, how much more infinite in extent and in eternally existing in time. So it teaches me about God. So before I get to my last point, I just want to pause a moment for a little interlude here. I want to talk a little bit about how these discussions of science and faith affect real people. And you're all came out tonight because you found this question interesting. You wanted to spend an evening thinking about it. There are a lot of people, though, for whom this question is soul-destroying or soul-enhancing. So I want to tell you stories of two people. Connor is a 16-year-old. He wrote to us. He grew up in a Christian school and a Christian home like mine, but he was taught that the earth was young, but without any other option, and taught it very strongly. And he decided to go and read about the Big Bang himself, and when he did, he decided that the Bible must not be true. The scientific evidence was so convincing, but he was also convinced by what he'd heard growing up, that either the Bible's right or science is right. They can't both be right, and he went with the science. Praise the Lord, he actually found BioLogos online, though, and started to come to an understanding, oh, it is possible to understand these together. He was so excited that he didn't have to choose between science and God. There was a way to put it together. Connor saw that what we're doing at BioLogos is still respecting the Bible's authority, even while we're talking about the discoveries of science, including the Big Bang and evolution. And for Connor, the more he learned about evolution, the more he wanted to praise God. And I want you to remember that, because oftentimes people think, oh, if we expose our young people to these ideas, they're going to be torn, they're going to lose their faith, and he almost did. But if you do it right, it will actually strengthen their faith and bring them to a deeper understanding of God and his creation. And then there's Dave, and he just wrote to BioLogos last week. He's 67 years old. He says he has never believed in God, but there's some events in his life that have prompted him to look for a relationship with Jesus. But the science versus faith issue has always been his main reason to reject God. And that, my friends, is where the rubber meets the road. These science versus faith questions, the whole narrative that science and faith are at war and cannot possibly be reconciled, is causing this man, Dave, to not have a relationship with God. But then he started looking online too, and he came across Francis Collins and his work, and came across BioLogos, and he writes, "The Holy Spirit is guiding me towards Christ because of BioLogos." And that's why I'm in this business, ultimately, for many reasons, but that is a big part of it. So for you, in your communities in which you live and work and shape policy and lead organizations, I hope you'll remember that we need a better conversation on science and faith. Remember that these are not at war, that we need to facilitate ways that these can be interacting, there can be positive relationships between them. And ultimately, a good investigation of science can enhance faith. So let me show you one final image here that has meant a lot to me. So this is a picture of the night sky. You can see a bunch of stars there. And here's the moon. And we're going to look at a little patch of sky this big relative to the size of the full moon. So it's smaller than your little fingernail, just a little postage stamp on the sky. And they picked a spot in the sky. You can see there's not much in there, okay? There's no stars, no bright galaxies in there. They picked a spot in the sky that was nearly blank. And then they used the Hubble Space Telescope. Jennifer Wiseman is here and has led that instrument. And worked with the Hubble Space Telescope to take image after image of that nearly blank spot in the sky to see what is there. What are the faintest, most distant things that we can see? And they found it wasn't empty. It looks like this. It's filled with thousands of galaxies. And this isn't a special spot in the sky. We have every reason to think that every little postage stamp on the sky is filled with thousands of galaxies, just like that. And for me, it's kind of a God's eye view of the universe. He can just see all of them, all the galaxies dancing and spinning and all of their different colors. But for others, don't see it that way. Carl Sagan, who was a great astronomer and astronomy educator, was also an atheist, and he wrote, "Who are we? We find we live on an insignificant planet of a humdrum star lost in a galaxy tucked away in some forgotten corner of the universe." Insignificant, forgotten. This is not science, my friends. This is a worldview spin that is placed on the scientific evidence itself. As a Christian, I view this completely differently. Yes, when I look at the universe, I'm reminded how small I am compared to God. But I'm reminded of who God is as the creator. In the beginning was the Word. The Greek word there is logos. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Through him all things were made. This is the beginning of the Gospel of John, and he's referring to Jesus Christ as prior to his coming to earth, prior to his incarnation. Without him, nothing was made that has been made. This incredibly vast multiverse was created by Jesus Christ. And the thing that makes me fall in love with God all over again, every time I think of it, is that the Word also became flesh and made his dwelling among us. He moved into the neighborhood. God came among us. He breathed our air. The man Jesus walked this earth, got the mud between his toes. He lived here among us, and he came for me. He came for each one of you. He came to save us, to have a relationship with us, to show us the incredible value we have in God's eyes. Whatever God is doing elsewhere in the universe, we know how much he loves us because of Jesus Christ, the cosmic creator and the Savior who came to us. Thank you very much.
Preach it, Dr. Haarsma. Preach it. I'm thrilled to be here, more thrilled that all of you are here. Your presence here indicates your interest in this conversation. That's exciting to me for a number of reasons. But I'm thrilled to be here that our church has a chance to partner with two fine institutions like the Trinity Forum and BioLogos, and excited about this talk. I'm such a dilettante in the sciences, and I'm so fascinated when somebody who knows what they're talking about can orient us to something like string theory and the multiverse. I'm not going to be doing that with my time. I've been invited to offer a brief response, a theological response, to be quite honest, probably a little more of a pastoral response. My vocation is not to be a scientist, it's to pastor scientists. And that's a tricky business. And so it's something that I think about quite a bit. But I've been thinking about this conversation tonight and how to respond, and in some ways, my response is as much to Dr. Haarsma and people like her and what they represent as it is to the topic itself. At the center of our conversation tonight, there's this striking fact that we spent some time considering. In the words of the physicist Andre Linde, we have a lot of really, really strange coincidences. And all of these coincidences are such that they make life possible. So the universe that we live in, against all odds, against much of what we know of the laws of physics, nevertheless, is so precisely balanced as to sustain and allow for the flourishing of life. And that is a profound fact. Dr. Haarsma spoke a moment ago about wonder, looking at the night sky. When I consider such a fact as the fine-tuning of the universe, my heart is moved by the wonder of such a thing. How is that possible? And so it begs the question, how did this come to be? And these days, the conversation, as we've heard tonight, has coalesced around, or at least in the kind of popular media, coalesced around two possibilities that are presented as being somewhat opposed to one another. Either this is indicative of a divine creator who in his creation of the universe has a preference for life, lucky for us, or it is indicative of a potentially infinite multiverse that, should that exist, does away with the need for a creator as an explanation. And the multiverse theory has taken hold in popular imagination, and it's been touted, and I've had a number of conversations like this, it's been touted as an alternative to divine creation that might one day put the whole idea of God to rest. And I think this reveals the deeply held assumption in our culture, as Dr. Haarsma alluded to, that we must choose science or multiverse, God or science, right? Science or faith. And the problem is, this is a bit of a false dichotomy, as we've seen here, because the framing is wrong. The issue is not necessarily one of science versus faith. It's actually a much deeper and more fundamental issue, and concerns the a priori assumptions that underlie our worldviews themselves. It, as a number of people have pointed out, is a worldview issue. So as Blaise Pascal writes in his Pensées, the issue is this: either God is or God is not. Right? So the conflict is not necessarily between science and faith. The conflict is between theism or non-theism or atheism. And Pascal goes on, he says, it is impossible to take one step with sense and judgment unless we regulate our course by our view of this point. In other words, our whole ability to make sense of, get our minds around, ascribe meaning to, and in some way explain something like a finely tuned universe depends on our a priori assumptions about the very existence of God. That's the starting point. So as I said before, my massive disclaimer, I'm a pastor, I'm not a scientist. I'm also not only interested in what people think, I'm likewise very interested in our motivations for thinking what we think. I spend a lot of time thinking about that in my own life, as well as others. So what fascinates me is not actually the possibility of a multiverse. Well, in some ways that is tremendously fascinating. I think it's incredibly exciting. But it's not only the possibility of a multiverse, because though it's not currently possible to test this theory scientifically, it could, as we've just heard, theoretically be true. What fascinates me is the degree to which people have grabbed onto this idea as an alternative to the existence of God, even though it lacks real evidence, even though at this point it is simply a theory that is somewhat effective at explaining things that we already know. And it's interesting to see someone like Richard Dawkins, who's a very intelligent and intellectually consistent person, assert on the one hand that scientific belief must be based on publicly checkable evidence, and at the very same time he believes in the multiverse as an explanation for cosmic fine-tuning, which lacks any publicly checkable evidence. It's interesting, and it makes you wonder why the inconsistency. And I'm picking on Dawkins. He's a somewhat easy target, admittedly. But there are many people, and many people in the popular press, who are making similar claims. It makes you wonder why the inconsistency. And here's, I think, where Blaise Pascal gets interesting. Because Pascal contends that no one is actually neutral when deciding whether they believe in God or not. It is not as though we sit in an intellectually neutral space, look at all of the evidence, and make a rational, neutral, detached, and purely objective decision between A or B, yes or no. In fact, Pascal says, men despise religion, and here he means Christianity. He says they hate it and are afraid it may be true. They hate it and are afraid it may be true. Right? In other words, underneath even the most fair-minded, balanced perspective, even underneath the most nuanced, careful, conscientious objector, there is, according to Pascal, a natural bias against the idea of God, because we know in our gut that if there is a God, we can't live as we choose. We know in our gut that if there is a God, there is some level of accountability. If Christianity is true, we're not in control, and that is terrifying. And if you think that's not terrifying to Christians, I would love to introduce you to some Christians who could convince you otherwise. It's terrifying to us all. I'm not in control. I don't have the final say, even in the meaning of my own existence. It's terrifying. There does exist within the scientific community a subset of people who seem almost religiously devoted to irreligious causality. There's a Harvard geneticist named Richard Lewontin who is actually, I think, refreshingly honest about this. He says, it's not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world, but, on the contrary, that we are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Moreover, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. Very honest. In other words, he's saying science doesn't actually compel us to assume there is no God. Rather, our a priori commitment to the fact that there is no God constrains our approach to science. It's worth considering. And the question is why? Why absolute materialism? Why rule out God from the beginning? If Pascal is right, non-theists have a vested interest in finding non-theistic explanations. On the other hand, we also have to acknowledge, if we're to be even remotely fair, that many, 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 many Christians, many people of faith, are just as biased against the claims of science. It's interesting to hear the stories of someone like Dr. Haarsma, who travels in both circles quite regularly, and the kinds of questions she gets and the kinds of objections and reactions she gets, particularly from Christians, about the work that she does. And I think Christians can be tempted to view all science as suspect, that we need to vigorously guard our scriptures against encroachment from the secular outsiders. Even in situations where the evidence seems pretty incontrovertible, some within the church can be pretty close-minded. But my point is not necessarily to shake my finger at everybody in this room who might be represented. The point is rather this, that to the extent that we are all biased, which I think we are, to the extent that we are all biased, to the extent that we're all seeking evidence to support and validate our a priori assumptions, we can very quickly lose sight of the fact that we all really want the same thing. We want to know, where did all of this come from? And why are we here to begin with? We all want to know that. The most ardent atheist, the most passionate believer. Why am I here? Where did I come from? What is all of this for? And I want to suggest that both science and faith have something to offer in our search for answers. They need each other. So to address the Christians, to those of us here who are Christians, I would encourage you to draw upon the tradition that includes Pascal and Aquinas and St. Augustine, a tradition that recognizes that the natural world around us is one of the ways God reveals himself and his characteristics to us. That although we believe that God has revealed himself ultimately through Jesus, ultimately through the Scriptures, we embrace the value of scientific inquiry. We allow scientific discoveries to inform our interpretation of Scripture. We allow our interpretation of Scripture to shape our interpretation of scientific discoveries. And to put a little bit of a finer point on it, in the church, we need more Christians who are scientists. And we need more scientists in the pews. And we need more Christians in the sciences. And frankly, the church needs to do a much better job of encouraging Christians in the pews who are scientists to bring their knowledge and experience fully into the worshiping life of the church. I look at these pictures and my heart is moved to worship. I look at the wonder and the delight on Dr. Haarsma's face, and my heart is moved to worship. The sense of wonder, I feel it even as she describes it. That is the very essence, the very bedrock of worship. We need more of that. I've been fortunate to be at events where Dr. Francis Collins brings out his guitar and plays it, and we sing hymns. That's amazing, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about scientists having the opportunity. It's amazing. I'm talking about scientists bringing the full weight of their scientific expertise into the worshiping life of the church. Lastly, to non-theists who may be in the room, to those of us here who are non-theistic or atheistic, I would encourage you to consider that many of the greatest scientific minds across history have been people of faith. Isaac Newton, Sir Francis Bacon, Galileo, Kepler. Modern science arguably owes a great debt of gratitude to Christianity because the motivation to search the universe for physical laws and constants and properties was originally motivated by and flowed out of the belief that all of this was indeed created by a rational being. I would encourage you to question whether or not science benefits or whether it suffers from a rigorous dogmatic devotion to materialism. As John Haidt says, science is among humankind's most successful institutions, not because scientists are so rational and open-minded, but because of what? The peer review process. We academics, he says, are generally biased toward confirming our own theories and validating our favored beliefs. But as long as we can all count on the peer review process and a vigorous post-publication peer debate process, we can rest assured that most obvious errors and biases will get called out. Point is this: the peer review process doesn't work in an echo chamber. You need conflicting a priori assumptions, conflicting values, conflicting priorities, conflicting perspectives for it to work the way it's designed to work. Should we not allow for all possible explanations stemming from multiple sets of assumptions, including those that involve a creator? And the last thing I'll say, because I know I need to close, is this. For many who come to faith, I'll just let you know, if you're not one of those people, you're still trying to figure out what you believe, the process is much less a blind leap of faith and more like a scientific process of evaluating and drawing conclusions from available evidence. I'll close with a story that I heard from John Lennox, who is a mathematician and philosopher of science and frequently involved in Trinity Forum events, is a good friend of the Trinity Forum. On one occasion, after giving a lecture on the relationship of science and theology at a major scientific institution in England, he says a physicist asked him how he could possibly be a mathematician of his caliber and still believe that Jesus could be both fully God and fully man. He replies by asking a question. He asks the man, well, what is consciousness? I don't know, says the man. He says, okay, we'll do something easier. What's energy? Well, the man says, we can measure it and write down the equations governing its conservation. And he says, yeah, I know, but that's not my question. What is it? The man doesn't say anything, just smiles. He says, that brings me to my main point. Would I be right in thinking that you were about to dismiss me and my belief in God if I failed to explain the divine and human nature of Christ? The man smiles. Obviously, yes. He says, well, by the same token, would you be happy if I now dismiss you and all your knowledge of physics because you cannot explain to me the nature of energy? After all, energy is surely by definition much less complex than the God who created it. And then he goes on, why do you believe in the concepts of consciousness and energy even though you do not understand them fully? Is it not because of the explanatory power of these concepts? I see what you're driving at, he replied. You believe that Jesus Christ is both God and man because that is the only explanation that has the power to make sense of all that we know of him. Lennox replies, exactly. Thank you very much.
In our last few minutes here, we'll get to the most dynamic part of our evening conversations, the conversation part, where we take questions from the audience. So there will be people around with microphones. Just wait until you're called on and speak into the microphone. Those of you who have been to Trinity Forum events in the past know that we have just 3 rules for questions, that they be brief, civil, and all questions be in the form of a question. So are there questions from the audience? All right there in the middle. Can someone get to...
Hi, thanks. Great talk. I just have a question. I'm kind of curious what, if any, impact you're expecting from the James Webb Space Telescope for the multiverse theories. And I'd also like to know where I can get those earrings.
If you give me your email address, I'll let you know where you can get the earrings. I don't remember. Yeah, the James Webb Space Telescope. Jennifer might be better placed than I to answer this question. I'm not sure it's going to say much about the multiverse. It'll say a lot about our universe. Oh my goodness, how early galaxies formed, more about dark matter and dark energy and how the expansion is happening. For the multiverse, I think our next best hope of observation is from particle accelerators, to understanding more the properties of elementary particles, and that'll give insights into the potential of the string theory multiverse and also the inflationary multiverse, some of those early universe conditions. So, yeah.
Other questions? Right there.
I have a question that I really don't understand myself. And that is how time might play in the selection of these different types of universes. For example, the multi-universe and the quantum mechanics or any one of the other, the string theory. Could you comment on how time might be a factor in that? I mean, I'm thinking, of course, of God being outside time.
Yes, that's a great question. And not an easy one to answer. Even with our own universe, there's all sorts of interesting philosophical and theological questions about God and time. And I don't know if Tommy wants to comment on those. Personally, I see God as beyond time. And I think the scientific evidence fits very well with that, because in the theory of general relativity, we find that space and time are intertwined. And so they're one fabric together. And the most coherent picture is to see God as external to the universe or the multiverse, but creating matter and energy and space and time all in a bundle together. With the multiverse, then you have the potential for time to be running differently in different universes, having different starting points. And so that would also suggest God being beyond time. So.
In the back there?
There are actually two creation stories in Genesis, and I was wondering what you think about the contrast and complementary parts of both of them.
Tommy, you want to take a stab at that one? Want to go?
No, that's a great thing to point out. The first creation story that Dr. Haarsma mentioned is, as we look at it, it has almost a liturgical structure. There's a lot of great work that's been done in helping us understand, as we look at the flow of it, ways that it seems to convey primarily a broader theological reality about God's creation of domains, the filling of those domains. There's a rhythm to it that would indicate that kind of interpretation, and that the account is much more about the theology of God as creator and the purpose for which various things were created than a cosmology. The second account is obviously very different. We see in the second account the beginning of a very personal relationship, a personally identified human being, and right away we see the indication of a personal relationship between that being and God. And so for those of us who look at the Bible as a whole document, as a whole story that sort of has a thread of covenant running through it, in other words, the covenant relationship between God and his people, we see there the beginning of that covenant relationship between God and humanity. So there, I think that you're going to need to handle things very differently, because you're looking at something that's primarily intended to convey truths about our relationship, our personal relationship with the God who made us.
Any questions from this side, the audience? Okay, right. We'll go right back there.
My question is there a scientific explanation for original sin in Genesis? Yeah, that's my question.
Who wants to handle that one?
She said scientific.
Okay, scientifically, well, original sin and many of our other theological concepts are not things that we can address very well scientifically. Science is so good at addressing the physical world, but it at best gives some minor insights into some of these deeper theological things. I would be happy to have a much longer conversation afterwards, because we can quickly get into a lot. I will say there's a lot on the BioLogos website about this very question, questions of redemption, Adam and Eve, evolution, all of that issues. And there's some significant issues there. But I encourage you to go online, and maybe Tommy has a comment, I don't know. Yeah.
That's good.
Other questions right here.
Thanks. Oops, sorry. It's upside down. Thanks. I enjoyed both talks immensely. Dr. Hinson, Reverend Hinson, I enjoyed your presentation of false dichotomies at the beginning of your talk. And part of the radical in me just makes me want to ask, did you possibly, or maybe just consider that maybe the dichotomy that you presented between theistic and non-theistic, could that possibly also be a false dichotomy? And I'll be brief about this, but the God that I read about in the Old and New Testaments, especially in the Old Testament, has such grandeur and is so complex that I can't wrap my brain around that God. I'm a Christian because the Word becoming flesh and the person of Jesus kind of leading me where I need to go. Sometimes I actually go there. Let's see, I'm sorry, I got a little bit off track there. However, but there's just such complexity and grandeur in that, and frankly, most religious or theistic models tend to be presented to us as things we can wrap our brains around. And sometimes I think scientists and scientists in religion, they don't ask conflicting questions, but they ask different questions. So might that be a possible false, although it sounds like I'm contradicting myself, I know that, but I'm just wondering, could that possibly also be a false dichotomy that might fit into your previous list?
I'm not sure if this is what one of the things you're driving at, but I would agree, and one of the things that kind of popped in my mind as I was listening to Dr. Haarsma a moment ago is that in many ways, because of the rise of this debate, in an attempt to appease opposition to theism, I think many Christians have kind of been guilty of a reductionism of their own. And in many ways, I do think that we're guilty of sort of forfeiting or overlooking the sense of wonder and grandeur and complexity. I mean, the word in the Bible, holy, is a word that I think we've largely lost sight of. What does it mean to have and to believe in a God that is completely separate outside of, other than everything in existence, and I would say including time? I think that concept is something that we maybe have largely lost sight of. The immanence that we have in the person of Jesus Christ is something that we talk readily enough about, the humanness of Jesus, but when we go the other direction to the utter, almost incomprehensible transcendence of the holy God, I think, yeah, there's a lot there, a space not just for spreadsheets, systematic theology, but rather a space just to take to go to our knees and to be reminded that this is an awesome reality.
We're going to take two more very quick questions. So over here, and then we'll go right there.
So I'm not sure I know how to ask this but maybe I'll try and ask it as a physics question. But it seems like to me when I hear of people talking about the multiverse and from a scientific point of view, it's almost as if we are in the best of all possible worlds. And is there enough energy in the Big Bang that can leave us in the best of all possible worlds and have many, many other worlds? I mean, you mentioned worlds where there's far more suffering. It would seem to be most worlds would have to have far more suffering.
Who wants to tackle that? Deb.
Are we in the best possible universe? That's an interesting one. Yeah, I don't know. I'd like to think more about that, both scientifically and theologically. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I don't. I'm reminded of another theory of the multiverse I just came across, that in a universe, surely there are people who have developed a technology to simulate a universe within which all of the laws would be simulated, and thus our ability to understand any of this is moot. And it's a credible theory, apparently.
Yeah, it is. We're all in the matrix.
Right.
Guys, you have a number of young apologetics students sitting here tonight from Infantes Academy, about to head off to college. And I was wondering if both of you could comment briefly on how a Christian can approach someone with a very strong scientific materialist worldview, whether it's a professor or a fellow student in today's culture, today's world.
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. I'll give a few thoughts, and I'm sure Tommy has more. But Reverend Hinson already described the conversation between John Lennox and that materialist is one model of the way you can go. And another is to remind people of how much in our daily living of lives we are living things that go beyond materialistic explanation, in our friendships, marriages, our appreciation of beauty and art. You don't do a controlled experiment on your friend to see if they're your friend. There's things that go way beyond what science is able to address. But I think when we're talking with people who are not Christians, it's always about more than just engaging the intellectual arguments they might be bringing. What I've seen over and over again that brings people to Christ and brings them around is the personal friendships that they have, showing love towards the other person, truly caring for them as a friend, inviting them along to church to just see what it's like, and praying for the work of the Holy Spirit in their lives. And that is the ultimate thing that we need to be working for. Yeah.
I wouldn't have much to add to that. That's fantastic. I think the work of people like Charles Taylor can be really helpful in a secular age. He makes a convincing case for the fact that we live in a cultural moment that is, as he says, cross-pressured. That on the one hand, there is a kind of a rigorous materialism, but on the other hand, there is a deep longing for the transcendent. And in some ways, he says that as believers are haunted by doubt, which we all are, if we're totally honest, that people who reject all belief are haunted by belief. We are a God-haunted culture. And that yearning for transcendence, that longing for something beyond the physical material world is very deep. It's in our poetry, it's in our music, it's in our movies, it's everywhere. And so I think finding ways to help people understand that that is happening and to tap into it, I think there's something there.
Deb, Tommy, thank you. It's clear that there are far more questions, and although we are out of time, if you did not get a chance to have your question asked or answered tonight, fear not, you are in luck. There is actually an opportunity to continue the discussion in just a few short days from now on Thursday, September 22nd, from 6:30 to 9:30 at Busboys and Poets, which is hosted by Church of the Advent. Tom Burnett is standing there, who will be the main host. You can register on our website. There will be food provided, I think open bar, a chance to actually come, discuss, really grapple with the questions in a far more sustained way. We really encourage you to take advantage of this follow-up dinner discussion. It'll be a great chance to meet with other thoughtful people interested in that question. Also, just wanted to extend a second invitation to you, which is also should be on each of your chairs, and that is to join the Trinity Forum Society. Part of what we try to do here is to provide this place for thoughtful people to gather to discuss what matters most in a way that is highly countercultural at a time when it is the norm for public discourse to be characterized by triviality, belligerence, incivility. We try to provide a place to grapple with what matters most in a way that is both intellectually rigorous and warmly hospitable. Your joining the society not only makes programs like this possible, there are also many benefits, such as our quarterly readings, our daily What We're Reading feeds, discounts to invitations like this. As a special bonus tonight, we'll give you the reading of your choice if you join this evening, and really commend that to you and hope that you will do that. Also, just want to point out our reading tables will be open. Later this evening, we'll have our readings, and I know Deb will have her books available, and the tremendous BioLogos resources, which we also commend to you and encourage you to check that out. And we hope that you will join us for future evening conversations. As I mentioned at the beginning, this is the first of a 4-part series that Templeton Religion Trust has generously sponsored. We'll be hosting these both in the spring and the fall for the next 2 years, and would love for you to join us at future evening conversations on this topic. In addition, a Trinity Forum's next evening conversation will be right next door at the ballroom on October 4th. Invitations will go out later this week to hear from historian Ron White on his new biography of the faith and leadership of Ulysses S. Grant. and what we can learn from a leader who governed America, led America in times even more polarized than our own, and what the implications are for our own time. Finally, it's always appropriate to end with thanks, and there's many people to thank. We are thrilled to be working with our friends at BioLogos, our speakers tonight, Deb Haarsma and Tommy Henson, as well as Church of the Advent and the Renew DC network. We're thrilled by the sponsorship that's made this possible from Templeton Religion Trust. We'd also like to thank our photographer, Zach Miller, who's been a real stalwart, and our terrific volunteers. We've had some of our best interns ever come back tonight to help us put this on. Carrie Lucas, Drew Masterson, and birthday girl Nancy Ritter. We're also grateful to volunteers Elizabeth McClanahan, Carolyn Grace Brothers for their help, along with David and Dawn Bueller and Michael Overby, who were assisted at the BioLogos table. Finally, I'd also like to just thank my colleagues, Colleen O'Malley, Alyssa Abraham, and Ashley Wright Brothers for all the incredible work they do behind the scenes. Finally, thank you for coming, and good night.